Good morning, dear colleagues. Apologies for the short delay. We are still waiting for Ambassador Meli Duday, who will join us any minute for the opening remarks, but we don't want to make you wait any longer, so we will already say good morning and welcome you to today's event under the Watchful Eye, Gender, Human Rights and Surveillance. We want to discuss this today in this joint approach, so it's very great to have the autonomous institution, the OSCE here. We will go into this panel after the welcoming remarks, but I can already now tell you a little bit about why we chose this topic and why we found it important to explore the surveillance landscape and its gendered aspects and link it to the OSCE comprehensive approach to security. My name is Julia Haas. I'm advisor to the OSCE representative on freedom of the media and have the pleasure to moderate this high-level segment of today's event. We will afterwards have an expert panel, and we really want to go a little bit into the depth of what surveillance means, the extent it has, and really start with saying surveillance has many different layers. It has both the perspective of state surveillance, but also private surveillance. And it's really all around us at all times. So we know there are sophisticated algorithms that extensively track data to profile, to analyze, to predict, and potentially also to manipulate with risks it entails for public participation, for discrimination, but also for disadvantaging women. On the other side, we also have national security and law enforcement agencies that use surveillance techniques for crime prevention, for countering terrorism, for border management, cybersecurity, and other aspects. But also this entails risks of repression or erosion of public inclusive spaces and abuse of power. But before we go into this high-level segment, I'm very happy to welcome, Ambassador Natasha Meli Duday, whom you all know very well. She's the permanent representative of Malta to the OSCE and currently the chairperson of the OSCE Permanent Council. And if I may, I would hand over to you directly, even though you just arrived, but we are very happy to welcome you and thank you for joining and opening today's event on surveillance and gender.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for being late. This is not really a Mediterranean trait, but it's the destiny of being the chair, and everybody wants a part of you, so I'm really sorry. I was at a previous meeting, and I really had to run, and I said I don't want to leave other colleagues waiting also, because this is an extremely important topic and subject, and I would like to thank all of you colleagues for bringing us all together to discuss such an important issue. And I'm very happy to see a lot of female faces, but I'm extremely happy as well to see male faces here. And thank you, Matteo and Marek and Roberto for being with us, because as I always say, we need our allies to move forward. So with that, excellencies, dear colleagues, dear participants, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this important event to mark International Women's Day, jointly organized by ODIHR, the representative on freedom of the media, the High Commissioner on National Minorities, and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. It's an honor for the Maltese chair to support this event for two significant reasons. Firstly, the event provides the opportunity to explore a new topic within the broader context of comprehensive security by looking at technological developments and how they impact human rights and women's rights. It is true that in today's digital age, we all leave digital traces and share private information in online sphere, often unknowingly. It therefore concerns all of us to take a closer look at the implications of our online behavior and to better understand how our data is tracked and collected to feed into algorithms, targeted advertising, or other forms of surveillance. And it is important to understand the gendered biases they can reproduce and reinforce, thereby exacerbating inequalities and discrimination. Secondly, the second reason why the Maltese chair supports today's event is because it is an excellent example of a cross-dimensional and OSCE-wide collaboration, reflecting the OSCE's comprehensive approach to security and bringing together the vast expertise within our organization. I commend the organizers for this important initiative and encourage further cross-cutting collaboration, breaking down silos, which is extremely important, and maximizing our potential, the OSCE's potential. For Malta, mainstreaming gender equality in all areas and strengthening resilience are key priorities for our chairpersonship. And I believe that today's event will contribute to both of these overarching goals. So I was late, but I tried to be brief. I look forward to an insightful and lively discussion, and thank you once again for the initiative.
Thank you so much for joining us with your busy agenda and underlining that this is indeed a rather new topic, but one that is particularly important for a security organization like ours. And that's also why we are so happy to have this joint approach and have the heads of institution, both of ODIHR and RFM here, but also the director of the Office of the High Commissioner, and of course the Secretary General of the Parliamentary Assembly. So I think the high-level speakers of this event really don't need a lengthy introduction, but it shows that you hear the commitment to International Women's Day, to the topic, and also to really take this holistic topic of gender in a comprehensive approach and comprehensive manner. We will dive right into the discussion, but we also know that, Ambassador, you will not be necessarily able to stay for the entire panel. So this is, of course, understandable. So thank you very much for joining. And I would like to start immediately by asking Ms. Ribeiro, the OSCE representative, on freedom of the media, building on what we heard now. What do you think are the interlinkages between surveillance, be it state surveillance or private surveillance, with safety of journalists, particularly safety of women journalists, and the overarching media and information landscape?
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. It's really a pleasure to have you around this table to discuss such an important topic. Many thanks to my colleagues, many thanks to Ambassador Natasha Dodley for being with us. It's really an important signal for us coming from the chair regarding the topic that we are dealing with today, and at the same time, of course, it's also an important support regarding International Women's Day. We know that, of course, the chair is very committed, but it's always good to have clear signs that this is this way. You know, the good thing about starting after the ambassador is that everything has been said, more or less, because the idea was precisely, you know, to look at the gendered aspects of surveillance landscape within the broader context of comprehensive security. And I think it's always good to go, you know, back to basics and really put our topics in this context of comprehensive security. One thing that I would like also very much to say about is that surveillance nowadays is clearly dominant for obvious reasons. We have a technology that facilitate this kind of surveillance, either for business, commercial purposes, security purposes, but also suppressive purposes and malicious purposes. So this is where we live nowadays. It's difficult to escape because in everything we do, the digital component is there. When we work, when we have some some free time to enjoy, when we communicate with others, everything we do, in everything we do, the digital component is there and is very prevalent. And what does it mean? And I think that we are now in a phase precisely because we have the technology, we have rising threats, clearly. Some of them are real ones, other are perceived ones. These threats are threats on security field, and this, of course, creates a kind of a contradiction between the respect for human rights and the security temptation to forget, to put aside human rights, to securitize our landscape. And this is the first thing I would like to say. And that's the reason why I said also how important it is when we discuss these things to have in mind that we always need to look at security as, especially in this organization, as something that needs to be fed by the other components that are the other two dimensions of this organization, and this precise case, of course, the human dimension. So this would be my first message. It's important that we don't look at security as something that should prevail, that should be implemented at the expenses of human rights, but on the contrary, we need to find ways really to make the system operational, to make and to ensure that human rights are fully respected, and to ensure that security is fully achieved. We need really to combine this two dimension, and I think this is very important, and not to try to enter in a false dichotomy between these two pillars. The other thing that I would like to also to mention is what surveillance means for the safety of journalists, what it means for the capacity of journalists to do their work and to perform and to carry out their mission. And we know that, and this is of course true, whatever the purpose behind the surveillance is. It's for business, it's for malicious purposes, it's for security. In any case, the safety of journalists will be at risk in this kind of digital space we are living in. And that's the reason why the topic is so important, and we need to be very serious when we look at this phenomena and at these problems. But why the safety of journalists can be in danger by this surveillance? First of all, because surveillance will collect some very sensitive information about the sources, which is an integral part of the work of the journalists, sensitive information about the work that the journalists are doing, sensitive information about their private life, which is terrible and can be devastating, and now I will look at the gender aspect of this, and then especially in the case of women, this kind of threats is are even more evident. And women are particularly exposed, not only because they are journalists, but also because they are women. And what we see is that we have, at least according to the figures of the study of UNESCO, that more than 2/3 of women journalists are subject to online harassment, online attacks, and 20%, and in 20% of the cases, these online threats they became real. So there is nothing virtual about online violence. It tends to become a real threat and a physical one. So it's very dangerous. And when we lose this space for women, what the detrimental effect, the detrimental impact on democracy, on pluralism, which is the basis of democracy, is of course diminished, and it cannot be accepted, and we need to do everything we can to reverse this situation. So I would stop. I think my 5 minutes are gone already, but really comprehensive security and the gendered aspects of what does it mean, what surveillance does mean in this context, the role of journalists, the dangers it represents for journalists, and the gender aspects of the safety of journalists is also very important to consider all together in our discussion.
Thank you very much. I think it's really a good starting point of today's event to go back to the basics, as you said, and to remind everybody that human rights is an integral part of security and that pluralism is the basis of democracy and security. And also for underlining the specific challenges that women journalists face, and often these consequences are intentionally or unintentionally. This is also something that, of course, adds additional complexities to the conversation. It's very important to keep in mind. So building on these aspects that we just heard, I would like to hand over to the Director of ODIHR, Mr. Mikachi, to ask you if you could maybe explain a bit the general challenges that you would see of surveillance for women who want, regarding the ability and willingness to speak out and to exercise their human rights more broadly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. The chair, this year is very busy, and we really thank you, for taking the time for being with us, but of course also to the colleagues from the different institutions for being with us. I mean, this is a very important question. I think we will probably start to answer today. We're not gonna end today to the all answers we need as we conduct our human rights work. I think you said at the beginning, this is a new topic. It is indeed a new topic, but actually the topic of combining the need to ensure that the security doesn't undermine human rights, it's a very old topic. It's the foundation of this organization. It was the broader geopolitical concept that brought us together. But concretely, actually for ODIHR, it's a very old topic. If you go back, almost 20 years ago, we remember, counterterrorism operations and the need that was realized early on that you cannot do effective counterterrorism without respecting human rights. Or we go to many other topics, it's freedom of assembly. So in a way, I think we know where we are. We have the basis to do the work, but we have seriously new challenges, which are, due to the nature of the new system of surveillance, which is being developed now. And the intrusive nature is unprecedented because we were dealing with issues of using new technologies, let's say, for, at some point you remember the use of, teasers, to stop potential criminals or others, new technologies that needs to be regulated when is appropriate or not. Challenging, but quite simple. It's a physical element that you have to train people to control and use. With surveillance technologies, we are dealing with something which is not very physical and actually is mostly out of control at the moment, also of the governments, because there's no real legislation in place to oversight this. And I'm talking specifically about the algorithms which are used to surveil activities, and whether it's peaceful demonstrations or maybe places of worship, identification through facial recognition. This is software which is at the moment developed by private companies. So there are issues about the proprietary nature of what is done, and the level of oversight is very much limited. So we are approaching this, trying to offer the point of view and the background of our institutions and the expertise that we have to try to help basically legislators, law enforcement authorities, but also human rights bodies, independent institutions, national independent institutions. Some of you are here today who have the mandate in the countries to make sure that the human rights of their citizens are respected. And when it comes to surveillance or any other new challenges, of course, the angle of how women are treated, or even minorities are treated, always comes to the surface. Because when it comes to the implementation of security policies, unfortunately, there is sometimes, in many cases, a built-in bias within our institutions. So the problem with these new technologies, we already have some evidence that these algorithms are built with some bias inside. And what it means concretely discrimination. And discrimination is in the way this technology is being used or could possibly be used. Now, is this intentional? Maybe the jury is out. I don't think we have evidence at this point that there is, a political intention to use technology to discriminate. But this has been true also in the past. I think when there were, counterterrorism operations, they were not probably conducted, to target, intentionally specific groups, but they resulted in this specific targeting because there was built-in bias that maybe people of color or minority or religious groups would be more prone to be suspects. And so if you don't train law enforcement agencies to be mindful of this, the result could be that. But the problem that we have here specifically is that if the algorithm is built with a mistake in the way it operates, it learns the mistakes and it repeats itself, and it can grow and grow and grow. And this is the challenge with artificial intelligence, which is something which is out of control of humans, right? Because it works by itself. And so if it's not, or there's no oversight, or it's not built in a way to correct itself, or someone is going to correct, we may end up that, our Minister of the Interior will buy some AI software to do surveillance, and it could, repeat this type of mistakes and bias when it is in the system. So the complexity of the challenge is much bigger. And we know that other international organizations are working on this. I think the Council of Europe is negotiating convention on artificial intelligence and the connection with human rights. So this is something on which, of course, we all have to work together at the international level and at the national level, because no country has a solution, or no international organization at the moment has a solution. So I think this is a good way to start. And in particular, going back to the topic of today and the impact on women, we know across our work, both with human rights defenders or when we look at the involvement of women in politics, that attacks against women human rights defenders or women in politics are increasing. And this is happening both online and offline. One could say that this is maybe a result of the achievements that we have had, meaning that you have more representation of women, more visible positions of leadership. And this is, making this type of attacks coming out. But this means that it's also very dangerous, because it's also sending a message to the new generation of women that if you take that position, that may be the price that you have to pay. So that we have to be very firm to stop this before it gets backwards, because there's no guarantee that this kind of progress, which is happening, will continue in the future. So in this case, if the surveillance algorithms that are used have, and maybe I'll talk about this later, are not able to identify correctly the traits of people who are out there, we know that there's going to be more discrimination against women. Actually, we have evidence about that. So this is something that maybe will require further discussion, involvement of the private sectors and the companies that actually are producing this type of tools that the governments are going to use. Maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important to remember indeed that even if the scale and scope is unprecedented, the underlying questions are almost remain the same. So also the replies, maybe the human rights framework that already exists needs to be, of course, translated and adapted, but we do have tools out there to address the questions that we are raising today. Another point that I found really relevant that you mentioned is that there are these different layers of implications for women, right? You have first the biases in the technology that come from human rights and gender considerations not being considered in the design and development of the technology, but then also the second layer of the deployment and the implication is also different and a different extent. So it's really important to look at this different point in times also and the different layers that we already heard about. You also mentioned that there are specific traits that have different implications, which I think links to the question of marginalization more broadly, which brings us naturally to our next speaker and the question of national minorities, because the evidence that is already out there is, of course, shows that there are intersecting considerations. Gender is a big component, but potentially also other aspects like minority issues or other marginalizing and discriminatory factors. So, dear Marek Sicegil, the director of the HCNM office, how do you think national minorities, specifically women who belong to national minorities, are affected by surveillance and how that really impacts the possibility of creating inclusive, diverse societies?
Thank you, Julia. So it's great to be here. And on behalf of the High Commissioner, Khairat Abdurrahmanov, I would like to thank all other partners for preparing this very important and timely event, and also to Chairship of Malta for the support in this respect. And I think this topic is a great example of this cross-dimensional approach that is so typical for OSCE, based on comprehensive approach to security, because we have certain aspects that are relevant for all three dimensions of OSCE here, very present. And it goes without saying that surveillance technologies are more and more present in our daily life. And with the technological development that we witness, it will be even more relevant topic in the future. So it will definitely stay with us. And from the perspective of the institution of the High Commissioner on National Minorities, it is important to see the connection between women, surveillance technologies, and national minorities, also through the lenses of our mandate, which is very much based on conflict prevention, and the mandate that is to address national minority issues where there is certain conflict potential. In order to achieve this objective, our institution engaged in early action to promote the integration of diverse societies, but also we engage with participating states in order to assist them with good governance, policy advice, diversity management issues, in order to increase social inclusion and social unity. So the experience of the HCNM in this context is that well-integrated society are those that foster a common sense of belonging by facilitating interaction and sharing of different perspectives among the population. So here it seems that digital surveillance all too often might have the opposite effect, identifying, magnifying, but even, I would say, reinforcing certain differences between individuals or groups within society. And also affecting something that in Ljubljana recommendations or Tallinn recommendations, we advocated as a kind of town square for expressing different views, for a dialogue between different communities within societies. So this diversity governance principles should be applied in our understanding also to implementation, to deployment of surveillance technologies. Second aspect here, digital direct connection between gender equality and conflict prevention in the context of digital or other types of surveillance technologies. So we recognize that advocating for gender equality as a contributing factor to stability in diverse societies is an essential element of this diversity management. So all members of society could be negatively impacted by surveillance technologies, but not equally and not in the same ways, actually. And here, women, and especially national minority women, are particularly exposed when certain divisions within society or mistrust within the society is increasing. So this is also our observation based on certain experience from different regions. Then certain exponential effect of surveillance technologies on women's, and here certain chilling effect that might be observed that those technologies might amplify. So to discourage women from engaging in public life, especially minority women, because of the fear that their privacy and their also certain rights might be affected. So here we also see clear connection of those issues. Next topic, next issue that I already mentioned is this deliberative space that should be inclusive for all members of society. And we can talk both about real, let's say, physical space, but also digital town squares. So all members of society, including national minorities and women, should be allowed to participate in those discussions, both within communities, but also between communities. And there is certain feeling that digital surveillance of these spaces, both online and offline, erodes their value, as people might self-censor or withdraw from public deliberations because of the fear of this surveillance. So that might, in result, only amplify those divisions that we try actually to address or avoid. And final topic here, or maybe area that we are looking closer at, is the issue of data collection and how those data that are produced by surveillance technologies should be handled. So this is also part of our work on thematic recommendations, and we work with number of participating states in order to make sure that those sensitive data related to identity-related data are properly handled, and there are not misused in the governmental policies. So both collection of disaggregated data is also important part of diversity governance, and it is important that such data remain anonymous and fully respect also the principle of self-identification of individuals. So a person's identity as a national minority or other minority is subjective and cannot be determined by surveillance technology, and those technologies are usually used in order to profile individuals, which is actually contrary to the principles that we in the OSCE with respect to national minorities try to promote, because surveillance fails to capture the fact that identities have usually many layers. Yes, they are contextual and dynamic. So surveillance could potentially also reduce people and groups to static, predefined by algorithms identities, which actually is not contributing to the integration of societies. So national minorities, especially national minority women, face higher level of this risk of discrimination when stereotypes are perpetuated by the surveillance technologies, but also they require much stronger protection with regard to their rights in this context.
Thank you very much. I think this underlying that there are specific, or if we want to have inclusive societies, we need to find inclusive responses to challenges is not only an important point, but links back to what we heard in the very beginning, that pluralism is really the starting point for democracy and security. I will now already try to move a little bit towards what we can do and how we can better work together to address the challenges that you have been explaining to us now in this first round, and move to the Secretary General of the Parliamentary Assembly, Roberto Montella, to ask you a bit, how do you think what you heard from the three institutions now, how can the institutions and all of us work more also together with parliamentarians, with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, to address the challenges that are linked to gender and surveillance?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Natasha, Teresa, Matteo, Marek, for sharing the podium and for taking this good initiative. It's quite a challenge, I must say. Like it's some say it's a new topic or no topic. I will get to that because also the Parliamentary Assembly had a resolution already on this topic in 2014. The conference is quite under the Watchful eye, so you already feel okay. Challenge there, no pressure. I think it's the first time in my life that I ever speak in front of a room full of women on issues of gender, which I do feel the pressure to say whatever is politically correct in this business. I do feel all the pressure. Normally, I'm notoriously not somebody who's been put under pressure, but this time I do feel it all. Now, to answer your question, how we can work together, and you know that I am a great advocate of cooperation within the OSCE, and this whole concept of OSCE delivering as a whole as something that I have tried to implement within the Parliamentary Assembly for many years, especially in times when, let's say, cooperation between the parliamentary dimension and the intergovernmental dimension was a bit difficult. Let's say in the last 10 years, the situation has been much better and much more improved. But I think the panel is already a plastic evidence of how we can cooperate together. I mean, we work on these issues very much together. But let's say, what is the key of the Parliamentary Assembly? And the Parliamentary Assembly has three main functions. You know, like parliamentarians have three main functions. So they speak up. So they can bring up these issues in the public domain. They can, all the very interesting things that Matteo were mentioning about the algorithms and stuff can be, of course, even more portrayed in the public eye by parliamentarians. They can raise awareness on these issues. Secondly, the parliamentarians legislate. So they legislate in the national parliament. So, of course, they can introduce stricter legislations or legislations that address all the challenges on these topics. And they also legislate not only within the national parliaments, but also within the Parliamentary Assembly. Every year, we come up with 15 supplementary items with resolutions, report that kind of inform the entire, let's say, OSCE family about where parliamentarians stand on these issues. Another key of the Parliamentary Assembly is that we can do that because we have the possibility of voting documents by majority. You know how difficult it might be within the OSCE have a ministerial declaration or a document of the OSCE as such on these issues, because you need consensus, and sometimes you may not reach consensus not because of the subject matter but because of other political issues. In the Parliamentary Assembly, we have the advantage that a topic like this can be brought to the attention of our parliamentarians and actually be voted in our committees and in our plenaries. Lastly, I would say an important role of parliamentarians is that of oversight, of control. Matteo said also what can we do to avoid that surveillance is used also in a malign way. Well, parliamentarians has also this kind of responsibility to exercise oversight and control, and also include oversight and control within the legislation we produce. So I think this is a way to use the Parliamentary Assembly in the right way. How to cooperate? I mean, the institutions do cooperate. We just had a meeting last February in Vienna here, and many of you, or all of you, participated in our committees, presented in these committees. So already, let's say, the indications, the ideas that you have become part of the legislative process of the Parliamentary Assembly, which will produce resolutions by April, and then in July in Bucharest will pass on. So this is a kind of an implicit, this is the, let's say, the institutional moment when we actually cooperate is the winter meeting in Vienna, which was actually established for that reason, to make sure that the entire expertise of the OSCE kind of plugs into the Parliamentary Assembly and then becomes also a legislative, let's say, production. And of course, as we know in the OSCE, nothing is a legally binding characteristic, but it's very good that the ideas that you have get into documents that then can be referred to later on. So I would leave it at that, and then there is something else that I would like to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for underlying really how the existing fora are already out there and how we can build more to strengthen this multi-stakeholder and inclusive approach. We don't have that much time anymore, so the second round will be a bit shorter than we intended. Apologies for that. But I want to still give each of you the possibility to explain a bit the way forward, or how you really see that we can take today's event to say this is not, it's really a starting point. It's whether it's a new topic or not, but it's a starting point for working more together in each of the institutions and the different actors. So very briefly, just for each of you, so we have a chance to finish on time and hand over to the second panel. I would like to maybe start again with you, Ms. Ribeiro, to say, we heard now everything about the need for inclusive spaces, but also, of course, inclusive information spaces, which are very often the starting point of democracy and democratic deliberations and the exercise of other human rights. So how do you think, what would be a concrete way forward to create such inclusive, healthy information spaces, both in the offline and digital online world?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm struggling here with the microphone. Yes, let's be brief. And everything has been said regarding the dangers, not everything, the threats, etc., and how the new technologies are kind of a magnifier of of all the problems we have in the offline space. So we need to. It's a magnifier, and and it's also in some cases the reason, the cause of other issues and other threats, and that's the reason why we need resolutely look at the solutions and to see what can we do. And the first thing, of course, we need to solve and to deal with this topic, not to solve, unfortunately, but at least to deal with this topic at international level. It's not possible to try to solve it at national level for obvious reasons, and because of the nature of these technologies that do not stop at the border. And this is the first issue. At the same time, I think that OSCE is in a way a very good framework to work with this, precisely because it's looking very firmly to human rights and have all these different institutions that with the PA, of course, and for obvious reasons and the reasons you just mentioned, to work together and to try to find new solutions. Regarding what I think it's necessary to within our space of the DRFOM, what are we doing regarding this? So we are now starting to work on creating healthier digital spaces. It will require, of course, the contributions of the other institutions, but the idea is, and this I think it's very important, we cannot just to be in a defensive way and saying that some safeguards are enough. Really to protect the detrimental effects of the new technologies. We need a much more offensive approach and really work on the sense of using this new technology to boost democracy and to create digital spaces that are fully complying with human rights and that really can contribute to our security. And I think I will have to leave it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think in the beginning of the session, we won't solve it today, but at least we have this conversation and really trying to reshift the conversation, as you say, to say how can we build this technology that is centering on human rights and public interest. This, of course, is also linked to questions of governance and human rights-based governance. So moving to you, Mr. Mekachi, maybe you can also very briefly underline how you think how can we use the existing human rights framework? Because you also said before, it's not entirely new challenge as always. So how can we use the existing human rights framework to strengthen governance, including when state actors and law enforcement and agency as such use surveillance technologies?
So if I have to identify one priority, I would say oversight, oversight, oversight. So it's three, but that's the point. And I'm saying this because we need to have a pragmatic approach. Actually, surveillance technology can be helpful, okay, to a law enforcement. So we're not here to say, oh, it shouldn't be used. We don't see any reasons for that. It needs to be used, but we know from history that if it's not used well, it's also not effective. I mentioned before counterterrorism. You remember when there was this discussion about techniques for interrogations, right? That maybe torture could lead to find useful information. It is now proven it doesn't work, okay? It doesn't work. So being compliant with human rights means making law enforcement more effective. That's the point of the pragmatism, which I think the human rights community is now endorsing full speed. So this should be seen as a joint effort. As you know, we have other programs, prevention of torture in places of detention, other things that we do to help law enforcement do their job better. This is the same approach that we need to advocate for. So not to see this as a confrontation, but actually working together. And actually the parliaments can be very helpful because we have one tool as at ODIHR, as you know, which are legal opinions, right? So if there are parliaments which are going to enter this new territory, one opportunity is to reach out to us, to the Venice Commission, to other bodies to have legal opinions to understand whether the legislation is compliant with the human rights standards. And we are saying this because, as you know, at ODIHR, we love data, whether it's for election observations, hate crime reports. So we have a little bit of data also here. And it comes down to facial recognition. So we have evidence that, and I will read this to be very precise, that there are mistakes which are done by facial recognition algorithms, and when these mistakes are more likely to negatively impact women and people of color, with women with darker skin found to be misclassified by facial recognition by between 20% and 34%, while lighter skinned men like me can misclassified only between 0% and 0.8%. So there is already data that shows that the algorithm with this use has built-in bias. So we need to find space for dialogue with these companies and with the Ministry of the Interior who are using these technologies to address these topics. So when it comes down to oversight, it means that these technologies needs to be scrutinized when starting from design, deployment, and also when they're not used, because if that doesn't happen, there is a risk that it can be misused. We are facing a completely different topic. In some of your countries, you are discussing the use of electronic voting, right? We are advocating for the same. If you're going to use this type of technology, you need to be able to have access to the source code, to know who has done the design, to know who owns it, and if there is open source that can be scrutinized by the public. So these are very important topics. I will just mention that following me, you will hear from an expert from our panel on freedom of assembly, who will speak in the next panel, Ms. Ena Bavcic. And she will speak about the work that we are doing really to try also to address the question of facial recognition during peaceful assembly. Because one risk that we see is that if people and citizens know that if they now go to a demonstration, they will be identified, facially identified, and the information is going to go in a sort of government database available, this can create a chilling effect. And in certain society, this is not just theory, is the reality and may prevent people from exercising these rights. So the threat is very real and we need to be very alert.
Thank you very much. Briefly also for the High Commissioner, what kind of tools do you think can you provide to assist the states in building these dialogues and providing or mandating for the oversight that we just heard about?
Thank you very much. I can subscribe to everything that has been just said. From the perspective of our institution, I think it is important to keep in mind that states are responsible for the use of surveillance technologies by public authorities and through both legislation and secondary regulations, also by private entities, by the industry. And this is important because this area is having very specific feature that the role of the let's say private sector is of paramount importance. So the presence of technology giants, their role, both producers and operators of those technologies is right now of crucial importance, and cooperation with this sector is essential. So this is also a matter of good governance, and in relation to certain marginalized groups like national minorities, also a matter of diversity governance. So the HCNM has significant experience in providing policy advice, guidance to governments, policymakers, parliamentarians on different types of legislation, regulation, good practices, policies on diversity issues towards the better integration of diverse societies. So also in this aspect, use of surveillance technologies, I think we can be of certain help. And I fully agree with previous speakers that OSCE is perfectly suited, is well placed to address these issues from the cross-dimensional perspective. So I think based on the experience with some other issues that topics that emerged on the agenda of this organization because of the perceived need and importance, I think here some basic maybe work could be done also in cooperation with expert community, mainly related to the collection of best practices as the first step in this direction. And we have to be aware that there are also other international organizations, actors dealing with those issues. You recalled Council of Europe, OECD recently adopted recommendations on artificial intelligence, UNESCO, the same on ethics in artificial intelligence. So I think we are fully in line, let's say, with the trend that we observe in other organizations. So I think we should keep in mind also that when using surveillance technologies, that authorities, but also private sector should not perpetuate those harmful and discriminating stereotypes, norms, and bias. So I think it is the role of the participating states to make sure that such approach is not present in our societies. So I think we would be very happy as the institution to contribute to future reflections on this topic together with other autonomous institutions and relevant units also in the Secretariat. And I'm sure that my colleague, Dr. Kyriaki Topidi from the European Center on Minority Issues, who will speak in the expert panel, will further develop some of those elements. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this underlining the need for multi-stakeholder responses is really a crucial takeaway of this panel, also of big tech, but underlining the positive human rights obligations by states. Very briefly, Mr. Montella, do you have something to add as a kind of initiative or commitment from this panel that you would take away before we lead over to the expert panel?
You said very briefly, so I take it seriously. No, but I'm telling the line, you said priority, you said 3 times oversight. Probably it's your parliamentarian that is new. So it's funny, I talk about parliamentarians, but the only one who's been a parliamentarian is Matteo here. But on oversight, we have done something together with the ODIHR, actually oversighting together surveys within our national parliaments to see how they've implemented issues on gender. Everybody's announced the next speaker. I'm happy to announce that Eddie Fry, our special representative for 14 years on this issue, speaks as an authority in this department. So of course, I will hand it over to her. And for those who have time and would like to see, there is a resolution called the Democratic Control of the Public and Private Sectors in 2014. It's on our website, and I think it contains all these aspects that were already dealt with 10 years ago by our parliamentarians. But thank you very much for the initiative.
Thank you so much to our high-level speakers. I think what was clear really is we need more time to discuss. It's a very complex issue. So I'm very grateful for all of your commitment that this is only a starting point today, and we're looking forward to move over to the second panel. Please remain seated. We will just very briefly switch the nameplates. And before that, I want you to ask to join me in thanking our phenomenal speakers for sharing your expertise and also the commitments to further work in this and address it together. Thank you very much.
Maybe. No, that's fine. That's fine. If you'd like to take your seats, and we'll start straight away with the expert panel. I think it's okay with the online speaker. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take your seats straight away, and we'll begin. We will continue this morning with the second panel, the expert panel, and we will continue to discuss the focus of the previous panel. We'll continue to focus on gender and the situation of minority women, and in particular female journalists and human rights defenders. And we'll be examining how the OSCE participating states are to implement their commitments to ensure digital surveillance does not impede meaningful participation of women and girls in democratic life, both online and offline. We have 4 fantastic experts with us today. who we are very lucky that they have travelled here for this important event. And we also have one panelist online, Dr. Hedy Fry, the Special Representative on Gender Issues from the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And we're very lucky to have her, not least because she's joining from Canada at, I understand, 3 o'clock in the morning as well. So a special thanks to her for joining us today. Some of the issues that we will continue to explore in this second session include gendered surveillance and the use of surveillance technologies by private companies and the implications for privacy, freedom of expression, and media pluralism. Again, the impact on minority women, the role of the human rights framework in providing guidance and regulation for surveillance technologies, and importantly, the role of parliaments in regulating the use of surveillance technologies. I want to go straight away to our experts. And first, I would like to come to Lucy Purdon. Lucy Purdon is the Director of Courage Everywhere, a consultancy focused on gender justice, policy and innovation to advance technology for the benefit of all women. Lucy advises organizations globally on the impacts of technology, regulation and policy on human rights, and has campaigned for a plethora of digital women's rights, including better protections for women's health data and the removal of marketing companies from maternity wards in the UK. So first question to you, what is technology facilitated gender-based violence, and what is the connection with surveillance, and what consequences does it have?
Thank you so much. When Julia approached me to do this event, I thought, wow, this is something I've been working on for such a long time. And it's really, this is such an important room to bring these issues to. So I'm very, very grateful to be here. So I'd really like to set the scene of the issues that we're talking about. Women have always been watched, and it's never been easier to surveil women as it is today because of the range of digital products and services that we have. So when I first started working on tech and human rights over a decade ago, working on gender in the tech sector largely meant getting women online in global majority countries and protecting women working in factories that made digital product, that made electronic goods. And as technology developed, so did the harms very, very quickly. And it really was women activists from India and Pakistan that began to raise the alarm about what it meant to be online, and this being another opportunity to be surveilled in the home and outside, and also the rise of online harassment. And then the feminist scholars began to make this connection, and they really connected that online harassment is not a separate concern from surveillance. The two are very deeply interconnected in both their logic and the techniques that they employ. So if we look at kind of state methods of surveillance and also the methods of abusive partners, they're kind of the same. They're surveilling communications, tracking location. So it was really feminist scholars that made this connection. And we have a lot to thank from women activists, especially in Asia, for bringing this to our attention. So increased surveillance of women in both the public and private sphere can result in information being weaponized to harass and ultimately silence women. And when we talk about silencing women, this can mean removing women from public spaces, silencing their voices, but also murder. And I was just thinking yesterday about how women really have been at the forefront of so many social movements throughout history, but it really does come at a cost to these women. And I'm from the north of England, and it was 40 years ago yesterday that the first national miners' strike happened in my country, which changed so much about my region and my country, especially in terms of police surveillance and brutality. And it really reminded me of the women who were at the front of the picket lines while also keeping things together at home. So really under the risk of surveillance and arrest for just attending these protests. And so this trend continues. When we come to the present day, you know, first they came to silence the high-profile women, the politicians, the journalists, the human rights defenders, the women speaking out. And high-profile women have so much to lose, you know, the physical threat, the damage to their reputation, cultural rejection. I'm seeing activists now in Kenya who are being questioned about the parentage of their children online. You know, this is sowing the seeds of harassment and, you know, that are incredibly damaging and make women very vulnerable in real life. And what this means is that women start to withdraw from public spaces and public life. And by silencing these women, we lose the ability to progress as a society. So with this lens, I've been looking for many years at tech business models, not necessarily spyware, which we will cover, but really the business model of most digital companies and most internet companies. And this business model allows our data to be freely available, and it's turned products that we use every day into tools of surveillance. And this really does have an impact on women. So let me explain what I mean by that. As you probably know, advertising is the lifeblood of the internet, and it allows us to access a wide range of services for free, but not for free because it's in exchange for our data and our attention. And monetizing data for advertising is the dominant business model of the internet. So for internet users, the reality means that going online means being tracked for advertising by lots of different companies, and not just social media platforms, but a whole ecosystem of companies that buy and sell your data in order to profile you for advertising. And these companies are not household names. You'll probably never know who they are. You'll probably never know what data they have about you and how they use it. So this commercial surveillance happens every day, all the time. And this is how the internet exists. Now, the tension here is that maintaining control over personal and intimate information is paramount for women's safety, and particularly in situations where they are temporarily vulnerable. But it's impossible to protect your privacy comprehensively in today's internet ecosystem. So recognizing that women's data is freely available can lead to endless harms. It's weaponized against us. In this case, we're talking about surveillance. But when data is weaponized against women, safety is a constantly moving goalpost for women. It puts women in a constant state of alert and never-ending vulnerable situations. And this is not a position in which we are able to fight for gender equality. And I think one of the real warning signs for me about how far surveillance was being baked into our everyday products was when Facebook began using facial recognition on the platform in 2017. And this was in order to for you to be able to tag photos of your friends automatically. Now, this is military grade software, and it really kind of showed that the blur between state surveillance and commercial surveillance was really happening here, and that we were really normalizing surveillance by putting these tools into our everyday products. And now look where we are in a huge debate about the place of facial recognition in society. And Facebook only removed this tool in 2021, quite recently. So this is where we are now. And when I started working on these issues, this was called tech-assisted abuse. But now the definition that has been put forward by UN agencies, among others, is technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And this is helpful because it's broad. And I think it's helpful to governments who are trying to regulate tech, but also law enforcement who are trying to deal with many of the complaints they are getting around this issue. So the definition of TFGBV is that any act committed or amplified using digital tools or technologies causing physical, sexual, psychological, social, political, economic harm to women or girls because of their gender. And it goes on with some detail. And I think this is extremely helpful as we move forward. So, for example, there was a recent UN report on civil society and counterterrorism laws highlighting the gendered impact. So human rights defenders, women human rights defenders have been listed as terrorists and subsequently experienced threats of rape online by military personnel. This is in the Philippines. And also women rights defenders are constantly accused of moral laxity, sexually promiscuous behavior, and this is creating real vulnerability for these women. And just to end on a couple of words, that this impacts all women. And if we're trying to get more women to participate in public spaces, we also need to think about the impacts on women and girls who are not high profile. So, for example, there is a lady called Amy Boyer in the US who was killed in 1999 by a man who was stalking her, and he was able to find her because he bought her information from a data broker. So this information about her address, her social security number, her location was freely available. And even in the UK, recently there was a joint letter from women's groups to tell women who were in any kind of coercive or abusive relationship to delete the National Health Service app from their phones, which was you were now able to access health records. And they were saying that this information can be used in coercive relationships, also in family courts, also in abusive relationships where contraception is banned from the home. So I think all of these, the key takeaways from this session, I think, is that, online harassment and surveillance are two sides of the same coin. It affects everybody, and it's whether it's state or commercial. And I've heard so many times that I have nothing to hide is an argument in favour of surveillance. But for women, we have more to protect and more to lose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for setting the scene and describing these quite complex issues in such a clear and accessible way. I think that's an excellent way to start this panel discussion. And also, thank you for explaining how technology has advanced, that the harm has also increased, but also the scope of surveillance and the impact, not just on individual women, but on society as a whole. You also mention frequently the impact, in particular, on minority women. And maybe this is something which we should examine now further at this stage. So I'd like to come to Dr. Kyriaki Topidi, who is a senior researcher and head of the research cluster on culture and diversity at the European Centre for Minority Issues in Flensburg, Germany. And in particular, her research interests focus on diversity management and minority protection rights and mechanisms with a special interest in religion. So the question to you is, why is digital surveillance an intersectional minority protection issue? If you could explain that.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for the opportunity to be here, because the minority perspective is essentially one that is not always, clearly spelled out. So in that sense, I think we're doing pioneering work. So to answer the question, I think I'll do two things. First of all, give you a few background considerations and then come forward with at least 4 reasons why digital surveillance matters for national minority women. So the first and obvious point to make, it has been already made in similar terms, is that gender equality and minority protection are correlated with social stability, state security, the rule of law, good governance. And we actually happen to live in times where minorities, national minorities in particular, are highly securitized. So that makes the discussion of a more timely. The second background consideration I would think is relevant to make for this context is that we should perceive technology as a two-sided coin. I mean, we are discussing the very challenging aspects of it, but in the beginning, technology in the digital space was created as a space that could potentially empower individuals to express their diverse identities. And in this sense, it could potentially, under the right conditions, strengthen minorities and enable collective mobilization. Of course, the story that we're discussing and hearing today is probably not that positive. In terms of comparative research, you should also be aware that few jurisdictions recognize gender as a distinct category for legally sanctionable hostility and crime control. Even less jurisdictions actually consider gender in conjunction with race, religion, or sexual identity. So we are essentially navigating a space which is not, mapped from the policy perspective. But the point was made earlier. Having said all of that, the digital space is not a neutral space. The point was already made that there is an exacerbation of vulnerabilities of people that try to exist online. And I think it's a very simple question that will give you the implications. How is technology is created and who benefits from it gives you a sense of the kinds of vested interests and the extent to which minority groups are being, considered in this discussion. There is, of course, variation. There is variation regarding the treatment and impact on the groups depending on platforms, but of course, the general trend is there. On top of that, you already heard that states use digital surveillance, and they have
always been using it, by the way, from the perspective of the HCMM's mandate, also in the context of a war, of a conflict. So this is not a new practice. It's just moving. It's another dimension of how things that existed offline move online. Bottom line, what I'm trying to say here is, regardless of the quarter of the room that you adopt in looking at this, minority women remain vulnerable. So that doesn't change. That's another thing that didn't change. For the purposes of our discussion, another point in terms of the background considerations that I was talking about is to consider surveillance in a broadest possible term. I think here we're looking at surveillance for national minority women that comes from states, that comes from tech companies, that comes from the general public, but also from their own communities. So if you want to address all of these implications or consider the web, the matrix of oppression, I think you need to consider all of them. One thing that was also not mentioned yet, but which is, I think, inherent in this discussion, is how we're talking about human, but also non-human surveillance. And that also is an element that we need to take in consideration in our regulatory efforts and in our policy recommendations. Now, social media design, which was mentioned in particular, but of course is only part of the story, enhances intersectional experiences of harm and oppression. There is research that shows that. In particular for our national and ethnic minority women who are disproportionately targeted by it. Now, there seems to be, however, a paradox when we discuss this. On the one hand, we assume, like I said earlier, the national minority women do not have, we know rather that they do not have full agency, but then we assume that they do because of the possibilities of the internet. So this is a false positive. And that is something that, you know, we need to unmake in our discussions and efforts moving forward. The other point, and that's going to be my final background consideration when we talk about digital surveillance and, you know, intersectionality, is the context of harm. The harm is extremely broad, and that is something that is also important to remember. Harm can be anything from, you know, speech engineered, information sharing, and all the way to physical acts. I was mentioning to colleagues that since the beginning of this year, we have the first case of digital rape that is being, you know, considered. And that gives you a sense of what are the new frontiers for the kind of a discussion we're having today. Now, let me turn very briefly to the justifications for making digital surveillance an issue for national minority women. And I said there would be four. The first one would be, why do we need to care? Because there are so many layers and forms of surveillance. I explained to you the possibilities included in the concept of surveillance. The second is due to intrusive data practices. Lucy covered that, I think, very convincingly and compellingly, but data collected through surveillance is used for public health, welfare action, welfare decision and access, population control, measurement of participation, and you name it. The list is super long and is getting longer. And then the third reason is because of the impact that it has on social justice and the kind of shortcomings it creates. Minority women are deprived of access to the digital space. They are deprived of control over their own data and ultimately control over their agency. So it is a very disempowering trend. And then the final reason, and I'll stop with that, is due to the way that gender and ethnic origin biases are embedded in AI and in the way that, you know, all of this is designed when we speak of algorithmic governance. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for outlining the problems very clearly, but also already at this stage suggesting ways forward and what needs to be done to come to a solution. Right from the beginning, we've been stressing that minority women are amongst the groups most clearly impacted, and we need to think about and need to be in the forefront of our minds, but also from the beginning, women journalists and women human rights defenders, and the impact on them is clearly disproportionately large. And it's on this issue that I would like to turn to next. With us Today we have Galina Timchenko, who is co-founder of and CEO of the publisher of Medusa, the largest remaining independent news outlet. Medusa continues to reach millions of people inside Russia, despite the project's newsroom having to operate from exile for the last 9 years. Also, Galina has achieved and received the 2022 Gwen Ifi Press Freedom Award for extraordinary achievement in the cause of press freedom. Very glad that you're able to join us today. And I would like to ask, could you share your own experience with surveillance and ask you what conclusions we should take from them, please?
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to speak to you. And accidentally, today I have my personal anniversary. 10 years ago, I was fired from my position of editor-in-chief of the #1 Russian news media outlet under direct order from Kremlin. And I started Medusa 10 years ago this day. And it's my personal anniversary because since that day, I have 10 years experience of surveillance. From the very beginning, Russian propagandists followed me to Riga, Latvia, where I established and launched Medusa. They followed me with the cameras. They published my private address in their newspapers, and I started to receive suspicious parcels, letters, threats, and so on and so forth. But I became an expert of physical surveillance. But 1 year ago, I accidentally became an expert of IT surveillance. I used to say and to joke that I'm very fond of being the first. I am the biggest and the first media, Russian language outside Russia, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, I became first Russian citizen and first Russian journalist and female journalists. My iPhone was infected with the Pegasus for the very first time in Russian media history. So I became an expert in this way, but I want to share with you my concerns. My iPhone was infected just before the meeting with the other top managers of Russian media in exile. And we had to discuss the agenda, how to protect our sources and how to protect our journalists on the ground in Russia. And that day, my iPhone was infected with the Pegasus, and during next month, those people who infected my iPhone could read everything I printed or messaged or received on my iPhone. So the security and safety of Russian journalists in exile, Russian reporters from the ground, and my contact list was compromised. What I would like to mention, it was trans-border repression and trans-border surveillance, because I have Latvian telephone number and my iPhone was infected when I was in Germany, Berlin. So it was done on the European Union territory. Unfortunately, the Pegasus does not leave fingerprints. We do not know still who was infected, but if we ask question whose benefits, it's absolutely obvious, but it could be Russian authorities because I'm the person of interest of them. But what I would like to mention that what I notice that unfortunately there is no defense against Pegasus. The only defense is put your gadget into lockdown mode, and now it's 24/7 in lockdown mode. All that guys should know is your telephone number. That's it. You have no defense, and they can use your iPhone as a microphone, as a camera, to follow you and to make a surveillance on every contact on your iPhone. The second, I'd like to mention that I experienced total ignorance from the special services and security services from European Union countries. Nobody is interested in this except my fellow colleagues, journalists and European Parliament. And thanks for that, I took part in a special session that was devoted to this case and to use spyware on journalists and female journalists. And the last one, unfortunately, only Apple uses to say notifications about state organized attacks. And I received these notifications 3 months after my iPhone was infected, but never ever Google used to send such notifications. So those people who have Androids are under double threat, and neither IT companies nor special services nor policies of European Union did not pay attention to this case. And it's not about me, it's not about myself, it's about all journalists who are under threat of surveillance, and it's all about opposition, political leaders, or any oppositional political figures who could be put under surveillance anytime, even at this place, this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing your own experience. I think it brings home to us all very clearly what the consequences of surveillance can be. And as you said and explained, there's no defense against Pegasus. So maybe it's time we go back to the fundamentals. What needs to be done? How can the human rights framework empower women to enjoy their human rights? And we're very lucky to have Ina Baric with us today, who is member of the OSCE ODIHR panel of experts on freedom of peaceful assembly and association. And she leverages her expertise in exploring the intersection of technology and human rights and gender equality. During her most recent engagement at DCAF, she delved into cybersecurity issues, particularly examining their impact on the rights of vulnerable groups with a focus on gender and human rights. And I would like to ask this question to you. In what ways can the human rights framework empower women to enjoy their human rights in light of the challenges we've just heard posed by surveillance technologies?
Thank you, and I would like to also thank you, my colleagues, for giving a thorough introduction, or not introduction, or analysis of the issues. And I think especially these previous statements have shown us why gender-based surveillance is actually a human rights issue, especially with the focus on minority, or I would like to say, women who face multiple discrimination and women human rights offenders. I just want to add to their points that we need to have in mind that in the context of cybersecurity, that sometimes surveillance is employed under the pretext of security of women and girls, such as, for example, social media monitoring by government or mass surveillance in public spaces to prevent violence against women, allegedly. However, the employment of such technologies do not consider how actually women are being affected by the very technology that is put in place to defend them. And especially these technologies are not employed in a way to take into consideration of women who are subjected to multiple discrimination and women human rights offenders. And especially now in the context we've heard in the previous panel of developing technologies and how they actually are how our biases are playing into these new technologies that are being developed. I must say that there is a clear danger of legislation that is being employed in alarmist fashion and that are not respecting the principles of proportionality, transparency, and inclusion. And in some cases, some regulation or some surveillance techniques are employed without even having a prior legislation or prior rules. So this is something that is having a disproportionate effect on women because such approach is often adopting a paternalistic stance, which is creating even more opportunities to control and dominate and create gender-related infringements on privacy during the implementation of such legislation and such use of such technology. So human rights approach to surveillance would be based on a human-centric approach to cybersecurity, where we should actually, when designing cybersecurity and cyber violence policy, talk more about how do we feel safe within the cyberspace and not how cyber networks should be secure. So we should talk of cybersecurity in cyberspace instead of cyberspace. And this would mean that, for example, as Mr. Matteo has mentioned, as a part of panel of experts on freedom of peaceful assembly, we are now devising, actually analyzing different regulations of different surveillance technologies. And there is a huge call to ban technologies that are seen as inherently disproportionate, such as biometric mass surveillance and the use of spyware, as we've previously heard. So, I mean, I don't even need to explain how, if we actually include this in the human rights framework, this would have a significant impact and significantly benefit women as well and other gender groups. So in order to create such a human rights approach to surveillance and cybersecurity, we should have a more open process in drafting, adopting, and implementing policies around surveillance. So there needs to be inclusion of different actors from different government sectors, but also from civil society, from private sector, and from academia, different kinds of sets of experts. And especially, we need to understand how these policies would have effect on different groups in the society and adopt this intersectional approach that we've heard before. And also, while creating the policies, I think the OSCE is really good in emphasizing that we should not talk about security versus human rights, but as we should talk about human rights being part of our security measures. So we should adopt this inherent, adopt this mainstream human rights in all aspects of security, and especially cybersecurity in the context of surveillance. So if we adopt this approach, we would ensure that masculine approaches in creating security responses are reduced, and this would mean that surveillance would be used only for very specific security issues, and that it would be used in a manner that would be taking humans in their center and respecting human rights. And when we talk, we have also heard before, and I think this is something where states would also take a leading role in creating business due diligence in upholding human rights standards, which would inevitably lead to less harm for women. And of course, obligations for private companies should also be based on the respect of privacy, free expression, dignity, and integrity of all people.
Thank you very much, Ina, for explaining the the human rights approach to cybersecurity and to surveillance as well, and the importance of drafting policies and regulations in this regard, and ensuring that human rights are being part of our security measures across the board. Well, there's obviously you've outlined roles for states, and within that, roles for parliaments as well. And that's exactly what we want to discuss now. We're very lucky to have Dr. Hedy Fry, who was appointed the OSCE's OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's Special Representative on Gender Issues in October 2010. She was first elected to the Canadian Parliament from Vancouver Centre in 1993, and is now the longest serving female member of Parliament in Canadian history. Her work focuses on women's equality, social policy, arts and culture, homelessness, and the rights of the LGBT community. And maybe before asking about the role of parliaments, not only the Parliamentary Assembly and national parliaments as well, on regulation, maybe if I could ask you first how you perceive the impact of surveillance, either by state or private actors, on the safety of women politicians. Would you have any experiences within the Canadian Parliament? Please, the floor and the screen is yours.
I hope you can hear me. Hello? Can you hear me?
Oh, and we all need the headsets, of course.
I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yes, sorry, we can hear you now, but we couldn't hear you up until this point.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Apologies for that.
I think I've been very impressed with everything that's been said so far in the panel before and the panel now, because surveillance is not necessarily a bad thing. Surveillance can be a good thing. Surveillance can be a protective mechanism in cases of security of the state, in cases of security of certain groups in our society. But I think that what has happened over the last few years is that women in public service, i.e. women in the public service, civil servants, women who are journalists and women who are parliamentarians, have been seen to be influencers. And of course, we shouldn't be influencers. We're just women. We're too uppity if we try to influence. And so the idea is to take us down and to make sure that we don't get to do the kinds of things that we can do to influence change in society. So women journalists, women parliamentarians, and women public servants are being targeted. And I think what we see is with the internet, especially in Canada, is that there are threats to journalists, threats to parliamentarians, and threats to female civil servants of rape, of harming their children, of sexual abuse, of all sorts of physical violence. We've seen in other parts of the region where there has been physical violence, people have been killed as a result of that, MPs, etc. We've seen that women journalists, actually, 33% of them don't want to write about certain issues purely because they're scared to do so because they've been threatened. And all you have to do is threaten the family and women clam up. And the idea is to stop women, to intimidate them, to silence them, to keep them in their place and get them not to become parliamentarians, not to go into journalism, and not to go into the public service. And this is probably the greatest form of gender repression that we have seen, I think, in the last century. And when I say repression, I mean it's because if you don't have women running in politics, if you don't have women making public policy as public servants, if you don't have women journalists writing about the things that are going on, then what you have done is you've created a silence on certain topics and you've silenced women forever. So intimidation is a big part of this. I think what we've seen in Canada is that we've done certain things. One of the things we do is that we monitor constantly what is going on with women. We have something called gender-based analysis plus. And the plus means that we don't just look at gender, female or male. We look at gender as a non-binary thing. We look at gender as well as statistical data that we get on how certain groups in society, whether they are men or women, LGBTQ, racialized groups, indigenous women, vulnerable women because of their income, how they are being surveilled, how they're being tracked, and how they're being pointedly brought to shame on social media. And I think that's happening in Canada. We've seen it. And I know that we've looked at the OSCE region, and we've only got about 29% of women in politics because women are now afraid to go into politics. And that is harmful to democracy as a whole. And so I think that's what we're doing. What in Canada we've done to deal with this is we've done something. We've put in surveillance, there you go, surveillance cameras in the offices, the constituency offices of female parliamentarians, in their offices on Parliament Hill. And they've got alarm buttons that they walk with, that they've got, we've got women being monitored constantly to make sure all parliamentarians are safe in their homes, etc. So that's one of the things we've done that has created a safety zone for all parliamentarians, but most especially for female parliamentarians. And I think that's something we should do, and constantly monitoring through gender-based analysis the intersectionality of women and the way that different women face different hate barriers when they actually get into politics, whether they, as I said before, racialized women, LGBTQ women, and women who are definitely Indigenous in our communities. So that's something that we are facing in Canada, and we've taken steps as a parliament to deal with that by these monitoring in homes and in offices, and giving parliamentarians alarm buttons so that they can move forward. We've also tried to train parliamentary protection staff to be able to be sensitive to the gender element of this kind of hate and threats. So that's how we're dealing with that at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed for that example from Canada and the threats to women politicians and all women in public service. Dr. Hidifrai, I wonder if we could stay with you now, and if you have further remarks, if you'd like to comment on how the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and national parliaments could help better regulate the use of surveillance by private actors and by states as well.
I think we as parliamentarians have some tools we can use. 1, legislation. 2, regulation. 3, public policy. 4, programs. And I will start with legislation and regulation. Example, Canada has just tabled something called an Online Harms Act. And it is amending the Criminal Code and amending the Canadian Human Rights Act so that individuals, groups, and vulnerable people in society can, if they've been targets online of hate, of threats, or of any kind of public scrutiny of putting pictures out online that were not given permission to do so, etc. It's going to put an end to that. It's going to have penalties for that. That's not going to be handled by the government, but going to be handled by a group called the Canadian Human Rights Commission, who are versed in this kind of ability to assess whether something is hateful or whether it's merely, we have to balance free speech versus putting some kinds of regulations on what we're doing with regard to legislation. When I say policies, I think one of the things we need to look at in terms of public policy is to suggest that we back up our legislation with regulations, and I think you've just mentioned that, certain regulations will come about. We have to be very careful, and we're being careful. And even this Online Harms Act that has just been tabled by our Attorney General is facing controversy. People are saying it's going to dumb down speech, it's going to stop freedom of speech, et cetera, but there has to be, that regulation has to be balanced. And in Canada, our regulation goes through public scrutiny, through committee, where witnesses can come and say, we don't like this about it, or we don't like that, so that we can have civil society and experts having a say in whether that legislation is too draconian or it's a good thing or not. And I think that's one of the things we need to look at as policy tools. One of the other things I think we need to do in terms of programs is to set up funding programs that would train judges, that would train police, that would train security personnel to be sensitive to what is happening online, and to be able to look at online harms and to look at how women are targeted, and women who are intersectionally different than just basic generic white women, that we're talking about women who are coming from different sectors of society. So the vulnerable is what we're looking at. We're training judges, we're training police, we're training people to do that, to be able to look at it. I think one of the other things we need to do is to look at how we deal with hate online. And we have set, with this bill, we've set certain penalties for hate online, including anything that is going to lead to genocide and to terrorism within society. So we've got all of this that we've bundled in this bill. And I think it's going to be needing a lot of scrutiny. Everyone's going to have something to say about it before it becomes law. But that's kind of where civil society and experts come in and start speaking on issues like that. But using funding as parliamentarians to help to train the people who are in charge of looking at online hate, people who are in charge of protecting civil society, is something that we also need to be able to do. So those are the 4 tools that we have as parliamentarians.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hedify, for those very clear explaining the tools and ways which we could move forward. I'm sure that was a very thought-provoking intervention, and I'm sure if you're able to stay online, it would be great to have the opportunity for people from the floor to ask questions in response to your intervention a bit later. We hope and we should have time for questions from the floor on these important issues. But before we do that, I'd like to ask quite a brief round of questions to our panelists in the room. And if you could be as to the point as possible, because we're running slightly over time. But staying with this theme of being forward-looking and looking at recommendations and ways to find solutions for these issues that we've discussed, and indeed the problems we've discussed, if I could come to you next. What, in your view, would a gender-sensitive and human rights compliant regulatory framework for surveillance technologies actually look like?
Thank you, Andrew. I will try to be as brief as possible. And I would also like to thank you, Dr. Hedify, for mentioning some of the solutions that Canada has employed. And I think one of the things that I also planned on mentioning, and I think it falls into what she has mentioned, is that what we need is, well, from my research, it was really clear that there is really lack of trust, especially of women victims of cyber attacks and cyber violence, including surveillance, to the government. So there is a clear need to improve laws, but also to increase the trust between the governments and citizens, and to develop more transparent online regulations. So we would need to employ a so-called whole of state approach to creating regulation around surveillance. One aspect of it would mean that the government should engage in comprehensive gender analysis of issues that may not immediately appear as gender issues. So, for example, employment of automated services in social service in distribution of aid and help, which may disproportionately affect women coming from marginalized groups, such as Roma women, for example, in the Western Balkans. So every type of technology should be analyzed from a gender perspective. And this would give us a better understanding of how to regulate it better for different genders in our societies. And as I mentioned before, this whole of state approach would mean that there is a consultation with a broad range of stakeholders. And this should be also done in actually when we are collecting this data. So the state, of course, should lead the process, but there should be a consultation with civil society, and because they are in touch with direct, I would say, victims or survivors of such malicious events, but also with private sector, with academia and similar. So there needs to be this whole state approach to designing the best policies. And then I would say maybe something that was mentioned in the previous panel, I would like to reflect on this. I think effective oversight should definitely need to be in place. So not just when we design laws, but also when we are implementing laws, there should be a parliamentary oversight, of course, but there should also be civil society oversight, meaning that there should be some sort of collaboration also with the government and civil society in listening to civil society of what needs to be done, and understanding that new technologies are developing and that we are not developing a fixed regulation or fixed oversight process, and that this process needs to be developed along the way. And I would say something that we are wondering within the panel of experts, and what is relying on basically UN guidance is that, and some of the acts that have been adopted now in the European Union, is that we should really have a risk-based approach to new technologies. So high-risk technologies that are indiscriminately targeting individuals, such as large-scale surveillance, black box technologies that we don't understand, we as a general audience, should be completely banned. And then this should also, we are proposing to extend this to untested and unproven surveillance technologies, as well as those technologies that are trained on the so-called bad data set that are amplifying discrimination and amplifying bias. And then also in the context of the company should acknowledge their duty to respect freedom of expression, privacy, freedom of peaceful association, and non-discrimination. So there needs to be a check and balances system in place.
Thank you very much for showing us the big picture and, as you put it, the whole of state approach. And outlining the stakeholders, and also focusing on oversight, but also the process in terms of what needs to happen. Maybe if we go from this overall or macro approach, if we focus on individuals now, and Galina, if I could come to you, given what you've explained to us a few minutes ago about the surveillance you encountered, how do you think we could prevent such future cases, not just against yourself, but other women human rights defenders, women journalists, and what is needed from states and from the OSCE? And I know that Medusa has a very elaborate and effective security protocol, but maybe not everyone is in such a fortunate position in that regard.
Yeah, I like to mention just 2 points. First, there are very few but very useful non-commercial organizations that help human rights defenders and journalists to detect, review, and to analyze the spyware programs that were used against them. And it will be very helpful if European Union organizations will try to help them and to support these organizations that helped us to stand against the unlawful surveillance. And the second I'd like to mention, it seems to me that consumption of spyware programs should be very strictly regulated inside European Union. Because as far as I know, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Netherlands, Germany are frequent consumers of spyware programs. If police wants to search your apartment, they have to have a court order. But if security service want to search your iPhone or all your life, they do not need any court order. So I want to mention that definitely we do need very strict regulations, because under the umbrella of national security reasons, there are many dark places where unlawful things happened. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And without further ado, if we turn now to the situation of national minority women, Dr. Kyriaki, what, given the implications of digital surveillance for national minority women, would be your recommendations that we could make in this context?
In the interest of time, I'll just highlight a few points that we haven't covered and then move immediately to the recommendation. From the perspective of national minority women, I think one thing we need to be aware of is how digital surveillance influences the need to assimilate. So these women assimilate because they want to avoid surveillance, and by extension, they self-censor. But of course, democracy demands more than that. The second point which I want to make is that we have increasingly evidence from national contexts that digital surveillance allows the development of an explicit link between misogyny and right-wing extremism. We have that present in Germany. There is evidence of that in the UK. Final point before I turn to recommendations are the societal participatory harms of digital surveillance, which legal systems, by the way, do not capture well, despite the fact that we have an increasing number of international instruments. Of course, the intersectional angle is for the most missing. Now, let me turn to the recommendations. A few of them from the perspective of this particularly vulnerable category of women would be to encourage states to look in robust governance and regulations. We did discuss the methods. We have tested and weren't very satisfied with self-regulation in Europe. Risk assessments are the preferred version, apparently, at EU level. States individually tend to, like the Canadian or the UK example, show preference for due diligence and duty of care. All of this, of course, is now hasn't been evaluated yet because legislation is so new. But in any case, I think the bottom line which should be to avoid technological solutionism and to strive for proportionality. And just a word of warning, proportionality assessments are going to be very complicated exercises because of the vast amount of data that would need to be, assessed. Then another option, I think, or another suggestion would be to push even harder for states and tech companies, I think, to adapt and adopt minority rights along with human rights that we just mentioned, because the digital regulatory environment needs to put emphasis on how we, combine voluntary social and corporate responsibility with tighter commitments. Then I think the other thing that could be done is to consider placing emphasis on harm and victim status within the way that, regulatory efforts or recommendations are being put forward, in the understanding, of course, and in the acknowledgement that we need more information, so more data collection. I know this sounds a little bit, from the state perspective, you view that with caution, but I think if you want to regulate something, you must understand how it impacts the populations and the groups. And then anticipate the challenges of generative AI and the metaverse would be something else, because that is, as was mentioned, likely to get even more complex. So essentially the scenario would be that very soon there will be non-human content produced, and that content could be harmful. And then the next step is, how do we regulate that harm when, you know, no humans are involved? And my final point for now would be that states must, of course, dig deeper into their duties of protection, prevention of violence online, and remedy of the harms. Because one of the biggest problems that we see with criminal law interventions is the lack of attention to victim status and harm. So I would, you know, place efforts in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very far-reaching recommendations. Perhaps before we go to questions from the floor, we do have time for that. If I could just ask one final question to you, Lucy. And also, I'm going to ask you to be brief in your answer, but it's also a very broad question. What needs to happen? What needs to change, not only to prevent such gendered harms, but also to empower women and inclusive public spaces?
Thank you. Yeah, so regulation's been covered. So I'm going to talk about a few things that, especially things can be done in this room. And I think the first thing is really the importance of conducting gender-focused research on the impact of surveillance on women. We don't have enough disaggregated data, and what gets measured can be addressed. And we really need to do this. And on that, there's a group of people that we haven't spoken about who are at risk, and that's independent researchers. And supporting independent researchers is incredibly important. They are getting huge pushback from industry as they try to investigate the harms of companies. And we've been speaking about Pegasus. Independent researchers were looking into Pegasus for years before it came to the attention of MEPs, because eventually MEPs had found found Pegasus on their phone. And so we need to kind of tackle the fact that tech companies are not open about the data they have, that there's no access to it, and independent researchers are now being targeted for the work that they do, and they really are the key to helping us understand a lot of these issues. One of the speakers in the previous panel spoke about algorithmic bias and how there is evidence for this. The reason that we have evidence for this is because of independent researchers, and who is providing the evidence? It's women, and it's particularly women of colour who are uncovering these biases. So supporting researchers is incredibly important. I would also stress the importance of gender mainstreaming in digital policy and ensuring that adequate protections are built into digital products to prevent surveillance. So while gender mainstreaming is not a new concept in policymaking, it's lacking in tech policy, and it really shows in the design and the decisions that are made across the sector, particularly in government data-driven initiatives like ID and welfare. There's some incredible examples from Bangladesh of women who are being blackmailed from information that's been taken from the national ID system database, and what that results in is that women disconnect their phones because they're sick of the harassment. So that's removing them again from public spaces. So we also need to reform the digital advertising industry. I was speaking a lot about this availability of data, and the sources of these data has a lot to do with the business model of the internet. There's a very core problem with the business model of the internet, as I've described. So I think encouraging and testing alternative models is really important. Advertising is not going to go away, but surely we can develop models that rely less on the collection of personal data by stemming its flow and reducing the value. And this is the direction of travel, but it's taking some time and it's really technically complex. But I'd just put that on your radar. And finally, in terms of empowering women as well, investing in women-owned businesses and founders and women's-led groups is incredibly important. Only a fraction of investment goes to women founders. In fact, in the UK, it's reported that out of every £1 of venture capital investment, women-led businesses get 1 pence. So this should be central to implementing strategies across government for women's health, alternative advertising models, the future of AI to design out harmful features that leave women vulnerable to surveillance and the risks that we've been talking about today. And I'll just end with a quote by Cindy Gallop, who's an advertising veteran. And she said, "The young white male founders of the tech platforms that dominate our lives today are not the primary targets of harassment, abuse, sexual assault, violence, and rape. So they don't proactively design for it." This is a design question, and we can do something about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming with that very clear point, which I think brings home the essence of the problem. I'd like to look now to the floor. I'm sure there are questions that many of you have for our expert panelists in the room, but also Dr. Hedi Fry online as well. If you could, when you ask your questions, if you could identify yourself and also the panel member that you address your question to in your questions, please. Also, if I turn to the panelists, I would like to give you a chance to come back and make general points, maybe reflections you have on the other presentations made by. But maybe what do you think of that? If we take some questions, please. I don't know if anyone would like to start. We can take several questions at the beginning. Those questions are there. If anyone would like to raise their hands with questions. Or comments, indeed, please. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. Brankica Janković, Commissioner for Protection of Equality of the Republic of Serbia. I think that it's really important to speak about a very relevant issue. This morning in the introductory panel, Mr. Sezigel mentioned that it's a timely event. But I think sometimes that is a little bit late but luckily we started to tackle gender's aspect of surveillance within the broader context of comprehensive security and safety issue. I can confirm from the perspective of human rights institutions, equality body in my country, that women, especially national minorities, women and female journalists are in a higher risk related to discrimination, and especially this type of discrimination we call the name digital discrimination. So to raising awareness about the challenges, we launched a campaign 2 or 3 years ago, Body Right. Your body is yours, both online and offline, and is still ongoing, but unfortunately, due to technical problems, it's not possible to show you. And we also translated to Serbian language, our mother tongue language, a glossary of the most frequently used words related to digital violence and technical surveillance in order to help, above all, to parents, teachers, journalists, civil servants, police officers, civil and other stakeholders to understand the phenomenon of digital violence. Because when we started campaign today, many journalists didn't understand some words we use in that time, and about the older generations, what does really mean trolling, for example, deepfake pornography, upskirting, sexting, slut shamings, etc. It's not an idea to pretend that we all understand that type of phenomenon, and we need much more knowledge and capacities to understand challenges we confront today. But today, gender violence, digital gender-based violence is really more than real dangerous. Sometimes with more complex and multiple consequences than the ordinary gender-based violence, especially to the mental health, social isolation. And we have to think about that from that perspective, and consider that type of violence more seriously, and to build all our capacities in order to make much more efficient protection of human rights, because it requires a better coordination of all stakeholders, especially include private companies, and to treat them as partners and friends. There is no other options if you don't want to include private companies, all state authorities, human rights institutions, civil society organization, experts, of course, such as you from this
Thank you.
panel, but above all,
Do you want to continue with a
education.
question? Because I would like to get other people in the
Thank you.
time.
I'm going to finish, but above all, educational system, starting from school as soon as possible, from the beginning.
Thanks
Thank you
very
very
much. We have a bit of time for our panelists, but let's take a few more questions, especially if they're brief.
Hello, sorry. My name is Lisa Dolan. I'm from the Irish delegation. Thank you, first of all, to all the panelists for a very fascinating discussion on an important topic. My question is maybe for Lucy, but anyone is free to answer. I'm just kind of, based on your intervention, thinking about the debate that's going on in the EU at the moment about client-side scanning. And there are arguments for and against, but I know that digital rights activists kind of argue that this is not the solution and could kind of bring an end to privacy as we know it. So what I don't hear really much in the discussion is the impact on women's safety. I mean, either for or against, and kind of a gendered kind of aspect to the discussion. So if you would maybe like to share your thoughts on that discussion. Thank you.
Are there any more questions at this stage? Yes, please.
Thank you, moderator. Anna Pogwist, EU delegation to the OSCE. We would like to also thank you and the panelists for your very important remarks, for your testimonials. We listened carefully and took a good note of the points you directed at the European Union. Thank you also for the recommendations on intersectional approach, on the gender analysis, for pointing out that surveillance technologies often proceed and facilitate violence online and offline, putting persons belonging to vulnerable groups at risk. And our question would be to those of you who still wish to address it, as some of you already touched upon it. In the context of your work, would you have any further recommendations on how to best address the gendered aspects of surveillance in the context of government's cooperation with the IT platforms? And using the opportunity, we would like to, us and member states gathered here, we'd like to thank the organizers, the RFOM, HCNM, the ODIHR, and PA for offering us this excellent opportunity to reflect, and for reminding us on how crucial it is to respect our OSCE commitments, in particular in the difficult times our region faces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can take one more question. It's brief. No, I don't see any other questions, so I'll. Sorry. So we have now just under 10 minutes left, and I'll go back to the panelists. And if you would like to reflect on the questions and what you've heard today, maybe if we can go now to Dr. Hedy Fry, if you're still online and you have reflections first.
I think I'm still online, and I wanted to say that one of the things that some of my panelists have touched on that I think is very important, one of them is research. In Canada, every committee and all the civil servants and everyone is taught about gender-based analysis. It means that you have to get statistical data, not only on sex, disaggregated data, but on intersectionality. In other words, religion, women's religions, their indigenous status, their LGBTQ status, because we know that those create double and triple barriers and focus for people to spread online hate and to pillory. I really think that that's important for us to remember. I also think it's important to remember that not all states are benign. And we have some states that will surveil women because they want to keep the state itself. It's not there to protect women. And we need to talk about what we do with regard to states that aren't there to protect women. I mean, this is a heinous thing, but we need to be able to deal with it. I think the important thing somebody said, which I want to point out, is that you need to have a non-politician or a non-political person actually doing some of the work of overseeing what's going on. And I think one of the things we did in our online bill is we brought in a Digital Safety Commission of Canada, which will be made up of civil society and experts, academia, etc., that are going to look at this act or this bill that we're bringing forward and make sure that it is going to be working with the human rights strand to it, but that it is not going to jeopardize freedom of speech at the same time. So we need that kind of oversight. I agree with that. But I think at the end of the day, the bottom line is that it is women who are targeted by digital violence. And I think that in itself will create a real problem. If journalists, I know that 33% of journalists have said in a UNESCO survey that they don't want to write about certain topics because they're scared. And if we don't have journalists writing with open minds and freedom of the press, and if we do not have women who are free to run for parliament, we have just been killing democracy. And I think we need to remember that. We are here at the OSCE PA to uphold democratic principles, rule of law, and democracy. And if we have states that are in fact surveilling women so that they could not protect but harm women, what do we do about it? Nobody has said what we do about those states. That's a really difficult thing to do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hedda-Frey. Lucy.
Thank you. I really want to answer your question. Thank you for that. Okay, so client-side scanning, I assume you're talking in the context of the CSAM, the child sexual abuse material. Yes, yeah. So client-side scanning is part of the encryption debate. And at the EU, there was a proposal of how to tackle child sexual abuse material, CSAM, and client-side scanning was one of those proposals. What that means is that all content is scanned before you upload it from your device. And so this is, the argument is that it doesn't break encryption. You can still have end-to-end encryption, but the argument against it is that it's incredibly intrusive. And this goes around. I wonder if this was an issue about the impact on women, that this would have got as much attention as it already has. I think putting, children in front of anything to do with encryption automatically has a reaction. So I wonder if these concerns that we're talking about do get more, more attention, that we might see a proposal like that. It's like, oh, well, it does protect women. But I think in terms of this debate, the encryption debate, this is something that's going to go round and round for a long time. And I would say that if the encryption debate starts including a gendered impact, we know that we're getting somewhere, because we know that these issues are now starting to get a reaction that we want. We still need to fight the terrible encryption proposals, but I would actually be quite happy to see a gendered impact, because I would know that the work we're doing is working.
Thank you very much. Over to Ina.
Thank you. Maybe just to briefly address the question around the government cooperation with platforms, and to sum up, I think when it comes to the private sector, there is a twofold collaboration. So there is a private sector, as our colleague from Serbia mentioned, who is local small companies who are cybersecurity experts who can help government develop better and more democratic regulatory policies. And then there's excuse me, big tech platforms, which are not necessarily under our jurisdiction or like under our state jurisdiction, and which need to have a broader rules of engagement. I think what my research that I have been doing has shown is that in any case, whatever kind of harm that happens online, especially on social media platforms against women, that these platforms are more responsive to the government demanding, for example, removal of certain accounts than to the victim itself. So in the research that we have done, we had a case, it's not directly connected to surveillance, but I think it's illustrative of how this works for a victim of non-consensual intimate image distribution. And where the perpetrator has continued to violate her online. So, of course, this has affected her mentally, physically, and socially. And she has continued to file complaints against Meta, even uploading the court order to ban this person from mentioning her, that Meta didn't respond up to the point when the police itself uploaded and contacted the Meta. So this is, I think, a very concrete example of what the governments can do.
Thank you for that concrete example. Dr. Kyriaki, if I could come to you next for a very brief response.
There's one quote that I really like, and it goes as follows: technology is both a source and consequence of gender relations. So with that in mind, I think if I'm to say a few concluding words, I would try to be a little bit deliberately more abstract and emphasize that if we're moving in a certain direction, we need to be in agreement about the values of that direction. So the ethic dimension, I know sounds a little bit abstract, but I think is important, particularly when we talk about accountability measures. And then the second point that I wanted to say is that in the end, what we're looking for and what there seems to be great need from the perspective of national minority women is to expand the online civic space that is available for these women to exist and be who they are. And, you know, they say a lot of times that online women are attacked for who they are, whilst men are attacked for what they say. So I think we need to close a little bit that gap. And I think I'll finish with that. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And that concludes this panel. The only thing left for me to do is to wholeheartedly thank all our panelists today for your excellent interventions and your thought-provoking statements. We've spoke right from the beginning how this event is very much the beginning of our work on this topic, but I think we can all conclude and say that it's a very good start. And there are many clear recommendations, not just to OSCE institutions, but to states as well as to what needs to be done. So thank you very much to our panelists for all you have said and all the good advice you've given us, and all of you for taking part today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.